Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Weisin and the University of California, Riverdale, as well as the American Association for Australasian Literary Studies for organizing this symposium. And I'm very happy to talk about my current project for this talk. So, translation and Australian Gothic fiction. The starting point for my talk today is a project I've worked on with my literary translation students for about 2 years, and which will see its conclusion later this year with the publication of the short story anthology Terror Australis, Australian Gothic, which was generously supported by these various Stiftungen, the Kunststiftung NRW, the Anton Beetz Stiftung, as well as the Gesellschaft von Freunden und Förderern der HHU Düsseldorf. So they make it possible for this to be an actually published book. But what is the project? Well, as part of this project, my students and I translated 4 colonial Australian Gothic short stories and 4 post-colonial and/or contemporary ones. Translating these stories by necessity meant in-depth discussions of all possible meanings, interpretations, and linguistic particularities of these stories. But it also allowed us to think about translation itself, both in context with the Gothic mode and with regards to our aspiration to create culturally and ecologically sensitive translations. Grouping the 4 colonial authors, Marcus Clarke, Barbara Bainton, William Sylvester Walker, and Rosa Pratt, with 4 contemporary ones, Lisa Fuller, Grace Chen, Michaela Saunders, and Gillian Pollack, also allowed us to showcase the history and development of the Australian Gothic, as well as the colonial and post-colonial power dynamics of Australia to a German audience. As you will see, translation is a multi-layered, multi-dimensional concept that goes far beyond just the transformation of an English text into a German one. And the translation of Australian Gothic short stories is in many ways unique and worthy of study as part of translation studies. But before I can go into detail and show you some specific examples from the project, it makes sense to start with a brief consideration of the Australian Gothic genre. And even that will give us further insights as to why it is so productive to view the Australian Gothic through a lens of translation studies. So in the Handbook to Gothic Literature, Jerry Turcott states, all migrations represent a dislocation of sorts, but Australia posed particularly vexing questions for its European immigrants. Nature, it seemed to many, was out of kilter. To cite the familiar cliches, its trees shed their bark, swans were black rather than white, and the seasons were reversed. And while these features represented a physical perversion, it was widely considered to be metonymic of an attendant spiritual dis-ease. Now, Gina Whisker in Shadows in Paradise ties the conventions of the Australian Gothic to these disturbing images of colonial existence in a land that seems to actively resist settlement and habitation, haunted by ghosts or phantoms, mythological beasts, unsettling oral effects, and the horrifying residues of colonial frontier violence. Whisker refers to Australia's mixed relationship of, on the one hand, the overwhelmingly other landscape, climate, people, and living things which the settlers invaded, in which they tried to incorporate, enculturate, relabel, or destroy, and on the other, the parallel lives and ancient histories of those displaced and represented as other, and the importance of relationship to country, which lies at the heart of Aboriginal culture. All these concepts played a very important role in our project. Whisker presents these 2 aspects as foundational for the Australian Gothic. And so we could say that colonial Australian Gothic writers had to translate themselves to fit into what was for them a foreign landscape, but also the landscape itself to fit Gothic tropes. This becomes even more visible in another article by Turcott, called The Kangaroo Gargoyles, which I think is a great title. And in it, he cites a kangaroo gargoyle at the University of Sydney and a chair made from marsupial skin as examples of the Gothic cultural fusion. The Gothic is a literature that deals with alienation, disjunction, terror, and conflict. It frequently projects its protagonist into an alien place where the character is tried and tested, and this protagonist is almost always victimized by a powerful oppressor. You can see why the Gothic is very fruitful territory for colonial and post-colonial writing. The colonist is uprooted, estranged, terrified, on alien territory, and pursued, if sometimes only in imagination, by a daunting predator, which in Australia was alternately perceived as the bush, the convict past, bush rangers, or the Aboriginal population. It is this overlapping territory shared by the Gothic and the colonial that makes the one useful to the other. If we now look at examples from the short story anthology Terror Australis, we can observe how the colonial writers translate the landscape into decidedly Gothic terms. In bush sketches, for example, Marcus Clarke describes the weird melancholy of the Australian bush as follows. In other lands, the dying year is mourned, the falling leaves drop lightly on his bier. In the Australian forests, no leaves fall. The savage winds shout among the rock clefts. From the melancholy gums, strips of white bark bang and rustle. The very animal life of these frowning hills is either grotesque or ghostly. Great grey kangaroos hop noiselessly over the coarse grass. Flights of white cockatoos stream out, shrieking like evil souls. The sun suddenly sinks and the mopokes burst out into horrible peals of semi-human laughter. So we have here the horrible peals of semi-human laughter, the shrieking like evil souls, a very Gothic tone to the oral descriptions here. Rosa Pratt in the Bunyip likewise describes the landscape in clearly Gothic terms. We have references here to the ghostly white-barked she-oaks, the creepy feeling which would come over the narrators as we trod along by the black water with dark, slimy logs slanting into it. And it's even described as quite a luxurious terror. In an article on transcribing colonial Australia, Joanna Collins refers to these strategies which both Pratt and Clarke employ here as sort of a failed attempt at translating Western conceptions of landscape. Collins says, the sense of translation I am deploying to decipher Campbell Pratt's work is translation as failure, along with Campbell Pratt's subsequent employment of adaptive strategies. Her communication of the landscape is also a form of acclimatization and, in this sense, a translation. So while Collins is here referring mostly to Pratt's autobiographical writings and the situation in the Bunyip is somewhat different, her ideas on translation and transcribing colonial Australia is still applicable to the Gothic short stories that we covered. In the Bunyip, Pratt follows a much more conservative translation strategy when comparing the Bunyip to European, quote-unquote, mythological creatures. Everyone who has lived in Australia has heard of the Bunyip. It is the one respectable flesh-curdling horror of which Australia can boast. The old world has her tales of ghoul and vampire, of Lorelei, spook and pixie, but Australia has nothing but her Bunyip. No white man's hand has carved records of the poetic past on the grey volcanic-looking boulders that overshadow some lonely gullies. This is, of course, a highly problematic framing of the Bunyip and shows how colonial white settlers transcribed their own cultural assumptions over not just the Australian countryside, but also the Australian cultural context. Part of our intention with the project was then to juxtapose these colonial transcriptions with, among others, Aboriginal perspectives. And thus, Lisa Fuller's Myth This provides a completely different outlook on both the Australian landscape and the Australian Gothic. But more on that later. Let's first turn to some practical examples in our translation process. Now, our goal was to translate nature, but also to translate fear. We did not want to misrepresent Australian natural environments, and so some of these terms were researched quite thoroughly. We had to consult dictionaries, obviously, sometimes very old ones. YouTube videos of bird calls were taken into consideration to translate words such as mopoke, which is in the Bush Sketches excerpt, which we then translated as bubuk kauts or bubuk owl. But another and perhaps even more vexing problem was Pratt's laughing jackass. So we have that in this little excerpt from the Bunyip. Now, the laughing jackass is easily identifiable. it refers to the kookaburra. And kookaburra is the term most often associated with the bird in German as well, though, as we will see, there are other terms. Now, translating the laughing jackass as kookaburra would be a valid translation decision, as it would be highlighting Aboriginal languages as opposed to Pratt's colonial rewrite. However, doing so effectively invisibilizes Pratt's colonial perspective in the German version. As Collins puts it in a different context, translation was an important strategy in the colonization of Australia, as processes of naming and categorization which enabled ideological appropriations of space. The earliest Australian explorers met with difficulties in translating the landscape by using the English language. While the naming process formed an integral part of mapping the new territories, explorers discovered that preconceived nomenclature was problematic. And so we did not want to translate away this colonial language in Pratt's short story. We wanted to make this colonial strategy visible. Now, a direct translation of the kookaburra, if we don't go with kookaburra, would be der lachende Hans in German. Now, a German audience will most certainly find this utterly ridiculous, which severely impacts the Gothic atmosphere we're trying to maintain. So instead, we had to choose the term Jägerliste, which is an official, though fairly unknown term for the kookaburra. In general German conversation, if we do talk about the kookaburra, kookaburra is going to be the term that we use. Now, Collins speaks of the resistance on the part of Australian flora and fauna to translation into Western laws of nature, which earned Australia an enduring reputation for being disorderly and topsy-turvy. In contrast to that, white settler attempts to name the Australian flora and fauna in English are part of the colonial strategy, which we then attempted to mirror in our translations. And while we implemented this strategy of translation for some of the colonial short stories, such as Pratt's, our approach to the short story Myths by Eidsvold Murray author Lisa Fuller was markedly different. Even though we also had to straddle the twofold need to translate nature accurately, but also in accordance with the intention of Gothic literature, to inspire fear or unease in the reader. Now, in many ways, Myths is a response to colonial attempts to override both landscapes and culture. And in this case, in this context, it is especially important to note that the story is in the Australian Gothic mode, but it does not feature ghosts or myths or entities otherwise associated with fantasy rather than reality. What haunts the narrative, then, is not so much them things in the bush, as Fuller puts it, nor is it any other threat posed to the humans by the environment, but rather the long history of European scientists' complete dismissal of millennia of knowledge as myth. This also explains the short story's defined title, Myth This, which challenges readers to try and read cultural knowledge as quote-unquote myths to their own detriment. Lisa Fuller speaks of her frustration when non-Aboriginal reviewers dismiss her beliefs that are represented in her writing as myths and legends. Referring to her novel Ghostbird, she says, "I talk about how these are beings we believe in. For us, their existence is fact, not some imaginary made-up thing," and goes on to demand respect for her beliefs. In a different interview, she tells us that she once had a weird standoff with another writer who challenged her statement that she believes in bunyips. It's been so widely appropriated they just couldn't fathom it. They looked at me like I declared myself an avid follower of the Easter Bunny. Similarly, in Myths, she refers to the entity at the heart of the story as a being that white fellas long ago made into fable, stolen for their own selfish reasons, spat on as nothing more than myth and legend. It is important to note then that the being, never named in the story, is not a threat out of hostility, but because they, the being, demand the respect they deserve. Now, in terms of translation then, we decided to veer towards not translating as a strategy in the case of Lisa Fuller's story. This could refer to terms for Australian fauna, the Doon-Doons, which stayed the same, even though we were able to ask Lisa Fuller herself what this was referring to, but also the more all-encompassing term such as country. Country, capitalized, does not just refer to landscape, land, or nation state, but instead, according to Amberlin Quay Mulliner, the source of all creation, all beauty, all wisdom. It sustains us, nourishes us, guides us. It gives us life and teaches us how to live so that life in all its shapes will always go on. Country is our joy, our love, our hope. Our country is our heart. It is, if you will, already a translation to English from a far greater and more complex Aboriginal concept, which we therefore rendered as country even in the German text. Another instance of non-translation is the term them things. In the story, it's rendered as them things, as her nan used to call them, the things in the bush that everyone's too scared to name. This phrasing already resists translation, even in English, as it is a way to pay respect to them things, while at the same time not imparting knowledge to outsiders that should not be imparted. In German, we followed Lisa Fuller's request to ignore grammar by calling them dem Dinge, which is not the correct article for Dinge in German usually, but instead is somewhat reminiscent of German neopronouns, thus marking the passage as special. Other instances in Fuller's story required us to translate nature terms in order to retain a Gothic atmosphere, so we couldn't always use the non-translation strategy. For example, the trees, such as ironbarks and ghost gums, do retain their English names rather than be translated as Eukalypten, which would be the general German name for these types of trees, eucalypts. But they are also accompanied by short descriptions of their outer appearance in order to maintain atmosphere. As I've hopefully made clear then, our translation strategies had to balance multiple demands. For the colonial short stories, we tried to translate colonial attitudes and not invisibilize them. But at the same time, we did not want to reproduce harmful concepts. So at times we worked with different fonts, different ways of typography, but also with footnotes. So that was a very important strategy for our project. We wanted to translate nature terms without reinforcing Western concepts, and also translating nature while maintaining a Gothic atmosphere. Sometimes this effectively led to us deliberately not translating critical concepts. Now, of course, my talk was mostly focused on 2 case studies, but the anthology as a whole dealt with a variety of other translation challenges, such as nature's agency, even in some of the colonial short stories, historical dialogue, Chinese culture, even multi-scripturality. Another story featured fairy tale language in combination with horror. Yet another short story employed Jewish culture and humor, as well as pop cultural references that tie the story more closely to a speculative fiction tradition. In some cases, though this was a short story that didn't make it into the anthology, we also had Western terms for certain animals as the established term, such as the thylacine, and they're not being like an agreed upon Aboriginal term. So we had to kind of balance this idea of translating with Western terms, but also, not superimposing a Western scientific lens, so to speak. So translating Australian Gothic short stories into German provided us then with multiple opportunities to contemplate cultural differences, untranslatability, our responsibility when it comes to translating nature. And in doing all this, we came to a much more nuanced understanding of all the stories we covered. Thank you very much.